Honestly, it's always your kind that has trouble with simple instructions. That single sentence, dripping with disdain, was the match that lit a firestorm at 35,000 feet. It was spoken by a flight attendant who believed she was untouchable, a queen in her aluminum tube kingdom. She said it to a black soldier, a man in uniform quietly trying to get home. Crack! The sound of an open-handed slap echoed through the cabin of Monarch Airlines Flight 557. The sharp, ugly noise silenced every conversation, stopped every movement. 217 passengers froze in their seats, their collective breath held in stunned disbelief. In that suspended moment, Rebecca Walsh stood in the aisle, hand still raised, her face flushed with vindictive triumph. Before her, Master Sergeant James Wilson slowly turned his head back to face her, a red mark blooming on his dark cheek. What Rebecca didn't know was that in her fit of rage, she hadn't just assaulted a passenger. She had slapped the one man on board who had the power to bring her entire world and her plane crashing down. In exactly 5 minutes, the course of both their lives would change irrevocably. This isn't a story about a simple argument. It's a story about what happens when arrogance meets authority, and how a single moment of unchecked prejudice led to a grounded plane, a ruined career, and a reckoning that nobody saw coming. Have you ever witnessed someone with a small amount of power abuse it so completely that it destroyed their life? This is exactly what you're about to see unfold. The air inside Monarch Airlines. Flight 557 from Atlanta to Seattle was already thick with the familiar cocktail of recycled oxygen, jet fuel, and human anxiety. The Boeing 737 was a full flight, a Tuesday afternoon run, packed with business travelers, families returning from vacation, and a handful of military personnel in transit. One of them was Master Sergeant James Wilson. James was bone-weary, the kind of tired that seeps into your marrow and makes your eyelids feel like lead weights. He had just spent 68 hours traveling from a dusty, sun-scorched outpost in Qatar, a place where the tension was a physical presence. All he wanted was this final 5-hour leg home to Washington. He wanted to see his wife Natalie and his son Dylan and feel the soft grass of his own backyard under his boots, a world away from the grit and sand that still seemed to cling to his skin. He'd found his seat 22B a middle seat as fate would have it. He stowed his rucksack, which contained little more than a worn paperback and a photo of his family, in the overhead bin, and settled in. He was in his uniform. The crisp lines of his Air Force dress blues a stark contrast to his internal exhaustion. His phone buzzed with a text message from Natalie Dillon's soccer team won. He scored twice and can't wait to tell you all about it. We're counting down the hours. Love you. James smiled faintly, the first genuine smile in days. He typed back, "Tell the champ I'm proud." Landing approximately 8:15 p.m. Love you both. He preferred to travel in uniform. It was a mark of pride, but it also usually afforded him a measure of respect that made the ordeal of modern air travel slightly more bearable. In his 15 years of service, including 3 tours overseas and countless flights, he'd learned that the uniform often spoke before he did. What most passengers couldn't know, was that James Wilson wasn't just a decorated Air Force technical operations specialist. For the past 4 years, he had served in a dual capacity as a federal air marshal, one of the invisible guardians who traveled on commercial flights trained to respond to terrorist threats and in-air emergencies. Today, he was officially on duty, though his exhaustion had made him request a passive monitoring role rather than an active security position. His training was extensive threat assessment, close-quarters combat psychology, de-escalation techniques. He had learned to read a cabin like a book to sense danger before it materialized. As he sat down, he had already scanned the flight, noting the exits, the crew positions, the passenger demographics. It was second nature now, as automatic as breathing. This vigilance was hard-earned. At 27, during his second deployment, James had faced a situation where racial bias nearly cost him his life. A fellow soldier had assumed he was an intruder rather than a fellow American serviceman, leading to a confrontation that could have ended tragically if a commanding officer hadn't intervened. The incident had left an indelible mark on his psyche, reinforcing his commitment to maintaining composure under pressure and assessing threats with clinical precision rather than emotion. As he settled into his seat, James noticed the unusually tense atmosphere in the cabin. The flight attendant working the economy section was moving with sharp, jerky motions. Her interactions with passengers curt to the point of rudeness. He made a mental note, another data point in his constant assessment of the environment. Today, however, felt different. The flight attendant working the economy cabin introduced herself over the PA system as Rebecca Walsh. Her voice was sharp, brittle, and carried an air of forced cheerfulness that failed to mask a deep-seated impatience. Monarch Airlines Flight 557 was scheduled for a 3:15 p.m. departure. It was now 3:47 p.m., and they were still boarding. The gate agents had announced a minor mechanical issue that needed to be resolved, and then a weather system near Denver had reshuffled the flight patterns, creating a cascade of delays that rippled across the country. Outside the oval windows, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. The captain had already warned of possible turbulence once they were airborne. The combination of weather concerns, technical delays, and a full cabin had created a palpable tension that seemed to vibrate through the aluminum skin of the aircraft. The Boeing 737-800 was configured with 16 first-class seats, 24 in premium economy, and 138 in main cabin. Every single one was occupied. The overhead bins were stuffed to capacity, forcing late boarding passengers to check their carry-ons at the gate. The air conditioning strained against the heat of closely packed bodies, creating pockets of uncomfortable warmth throughout the cabin. In the row ahead of James, a businessman loudly complained into his phone about the delay. "This is unacceptable. I'm going to miss my connection to Vancouver. No, I can't reschedule the meeting. Do you know how much this is costing the company?" Across the aisle, an elderly couple whispered worriedly about the weather, the wife clutching her husband's arm whenever the plane shifted slightly at the gate. Behind him, a pair of college students were discussing an upcoming exam, their anxiety about the test temporarily overriding their concern about the flight. The mood was one of collective frustration and resignation, the particular type of forced patience that comes with modern air travel, where passengers surrender control to the mysteries of aviation logistics and weather patterns. Everyone was on edge, but they were all in it together. April 15, 2025 would be remembered by everyone on this flight, though for reasons none of them could yet imagine. The mechanical issue had been resolved, but the cascading delays meant they were now number 7 in the departure queue. The captain had informed them they'd be taxiing within 15 minutes, which had brought a collective sigh of relief from the cabin. Except it seemed for one person. Rebecca Walsh moved with a proprietary arrogance through the cabin during boarding. She patrolled the aisle like it was her personal kingdom, her chin held high, her eyes scanning the passengers, not with a sense of service, but of judgment. Rebecca Walsh had been with Monarch Airlines for 15 years. At 42, she was neither young enough to be filled with the enthusiasm of a new hire, nor old enough to have the wise patience of a veteran nearing retirement. She occupied that difficult middle ground, experienced enough to know all the rules, but not seasoned enough to know when to bend them. Today had started badly and was getting worse. Her alarm had failed to go off, forcing her to rush through her morning routine. The final divorce papers from her ex-husband, Timothy, had arrived in yesterday's mail along with a past due notice for her car payment. The divorce had been finalized 3 months ago, but there were still financial entanglements to resolve, and Timothy was being difficult about selling the house. As she applied her makeup that morning, she noticed new lines around her eyes. Lines that reminded her that she was aging, that her options were narrowing, that the life she had planned, perhaps with children, perhaps with a promotion to international routes, was slipping away. She had covered the lines with concealer, but couldn't conceal the bitterness that had begun to seep into her voice, her posture, her interactions. By the time she arrived at the airport for check-in, she was already in a foul mood. The crew briefing had added to her frustration of full flight weather delays, and she'd been assigned to economy instead of first class because Gabriela Ramirez, the junior flight attendant who should have taken economy, was being evaluated for a potential promotion. Rebecca had smiled tightly at the news, but internally she seethed. She had requested that promotion 3 times and been passed over each time. She snapped at a young man for trying to fit a guitar case into a bin that was clearly too small. "Sir, that will have to be gate-checked. We are not a freight service." She publicly chided an elderly woman who was moving too slowly. "Ma'am, there are people behind you. We have a schedule to keep." 2 weeks earlier, Rebecca had been involved in an incident that nearly escalated into a formal complaint. A black businessman in first class had asked for a second blanket, and she had ignored his request for nearly 30 minutes before telling him rather curtly that additional blankets were for priority passengers. The man had pointed out that he was in first class and had status with the airline, to which Rebecca had replied, "Well, you're certainly making yourself comfortable, aren't you?" The passenger had requested her name and employee number. Rebecca had provided it with a tight smile, certain that nothing would come of it. And nothing had, at least nothing official. But the story had circulated among the Atlanta-based crew members. "Did you hear about Rebecca and the first-class passenger?" they whispered during layovers. "Classic Rebecca," they'd say, rolling their eyes. She told herself she wasn't racist. She treated everyone equally poorly, perhaps on her bad days, but equal nonetheless. If she was harder on certain passengers, it was because they were more demanding, more entitled. It wasn't about their skin color. It was about their attitude. At least that's what she told herself. As she moved through the cabin of Flight 557, checking seat belts and overhead bins, she felt a familiar sense of control return. Here at 35,000 feet, she had authority. She could instruct a CEO to fasten his seatbelt, tell a celebrity to stow her designer handbag, direct a politician to remain seated during turbulence. Here, finally, she mattered, and she would make damn sure everyone knew it. Gabriela Ramirez. 24 years old and just 8 months into her career with Monarch Airlines, worked the first-class cabin with an earnest efficiency that both impressed and irritated her more experienced colleagues. She had graduated top of her training class and had already received 2 commendations for exceptional customer service. Today, she was being evaluated for a potential fast track to a purser position, a fact that had not gone unnoticed by Rebecca, who had spent 5 years as a flight attendant before even being considered for lead positions. Gabriela moved gracefully through the first-class cabin, offering pre-departure beverages with a warm smile that reached her eyes. She had a gift for remembering names and details about frequent flyers, a talent that created instant rapport. "Mr. Jameson, still sparkling water with lime, correct? And Ms. Torres? I remember you prefer your tea with honey on the side." In the cockpit, Captain Michael Donovan, 53, was reviewing the flight plan with a methodical precision born from 30 years of commercial aviation experience. Before joining Monarch, he had flown C-130s for the Air Force, and that military background was evident in his precise language and disciplined approach. He was respected, even revered by his crew for his calm competence and fair leadership. "Looks like we'll hit some chop about an hour in," he said to First Officer Adam Weiss, tapping the weather display. "Nothing major, but we'll keep the seatbelt sign on until we're past it." Weiss, 28, and ambitious, nodded. This was his second year with Monarch, but he had already established himself as a capable and analytical pilot. He had his eye on the left seat, the captain's position, and worked diligently to absorb everything he could from experienced captains like Donovan. "I'll let the cabin crew know to expect some light to moderate turbulence mid-flight," he replied, making a note on his tablet. In row 23, directly behind James Wilson, the Foster family was attempting to organize themselves amid the chaos of traveling with an infant. Ryan Foster, 32, held 8-month-old Lily, while his wife Emily, 29, rummaged through a diaper bag the size of a small suitcase. Lily was their first child, and they were flying to Seattle to introduce her to Emily's parents for the first time. "I think I forgot the extra pacifiers," Emily whispered anxiously to Ryan, her face pale with worry. "What if she cries the whole way?" Ryan bounced Lily gently, her wide eyes taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. "We've got this," he assured his wife, though his own expression betrayed a similar concern. "We packed back up everything, and worst case babies cry. Everyone on this plane was a baby once." Arthur Kellerman, 44, sat in 22C next to James, a corporate attorney for a Seattle-based tech firm he was returning from a deposition in Atlanta. He wore an expensive suit that showed signs of a long day, a loosened tie, a slight wrinkle in the shirt where he had leaned against a table. He had already removed his laptop and was answering emails with rapid-fire precision, glancing occasionally at his watch as the boarding process continued to drag on. Across the aisle in 22D, Sarah Johnson, a pediatric nurse from Portland, was reading a well-worn paperback. In 22F, by the window, Philip Martinez, a mechanical engineer from Tacoma, was scrolling through family photos on his phone, occasionally pausing to zoom in on the faces of his children. They were all strangers thrown together by the arbitrary algorithms of airline seating assignments, each with their own stories, their own destinations. None of them could have anticipated how their lives would intersect in the next hour, or how the actions of two people would alter the course of their journey and leave an indelible mark on everyone aboard Flight 557. The boarding process was nearly complete when the Foster family, who had been patiently waiting with their infant daughter near the jet bridge entrance, finally made their way down the crowded aisle. Ryan Foster carried baby Lily while Emily struggled with a car seat, a diaper bag, and her personal item, a tote bag that contained everything from spare clothes to emergency snacks. As they reached row 23 directly behind James Wilson, it became apparent that fitting all their necessary items would be challenging. The overhead bins were already stuffed to capacity with roller bags and coats. "Honey, I don't think there's room up here," Emily said, her voice tinged with panic. The diaper bag was essential. It contained formula diapers, wipes, and all the other necessities for traveling with an infant. But the already crowded overhead bin seemed to have maybe an inch of space remaining. Ryan, now holding a fussing Lily, looked around helplessly. "Maybe we can ask if someone can move their things a bit," he suggested. Emily tried to rearrange items in the bin, carefully shifting a leather briefcase and attempting to squeeze the diaper bag into the narrow remaining space. The bag was almost in when a sharp voice cut through their concentration. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" Rebecca Walsh materialized at the end of their row, arms crossed, eyes narrowed at Emily's attempt to rearrange the overhead bin. "I'm just trying to fit our bag," Emily explained, still pushing at the diaper bag. "It has all the baby supplies we need for the flight." Rebecca's expression didn't soften. "That bin is full. If your bag doesn't fit easily, it needs to be checked." "But it's not a regular bag. It's essential items for our daughter, Ryan," explained Lily, now squirming in his arms. "We can't be without diapers and formula for 5 hours." "You should have planned better," Rebecca replied coldly. "You should have boarded earlier if bin space was important to you." "We were in the priority boarding group," Emily said, her voice trembling slightly. "But they asked us to wait because of the car seat installation check." "That's not my concern," Rebecca said. "The fact remains that if the bag doesn't fit, it doesn't go in the cabin. You're holding up the entire boarding process." Ryan bounced Lily, who was becoming increasingly distressed by the tension. "It's almost in," he said. "Just needs a little adjustment." "Sir, I won't tell you again." Rebecca's voice rose, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. "Either that bag goes under the seat in front of you, or it gets checked to your final destination." "But the car seat has to go in the seat," Emily explained, gesturing to the bulky infant car seat. "There's nowhere else." "That's not my problem," Rebecca snapped. Rules are rules. The situation was escalating quickly. Emily looked close to tears. Ryan was struggling to calm Lily, and Rebecca stood like an immovable obstacle, her authority absolute and unyielding. James Wilson, who had been watching the interaction unfold, recognized both the logistical problem and the unnecessary hostility. He understood what it was like to be exhausted and just wanting to get home, and he could see the young family was doing their best in a difficult situation. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. "Excuse me," he said in a low, calm voice. "I may be able to help. I'm pretty good at this stuff. It's like a game of Tetris." James reached up and, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had packed military equipment into tight spaces, began to rearrange the items in the bin. He shifted his own rucksack, turned the diaper bag on its side, and leveraged a corner in just the right way. With a few deft movements, he created enough space and the diaper bag slid smoothly into place. He gave the bin a firm push and it clicked shut. "There you go," James said with a small, tired smile to the couple. Ryan exhaled in relief. "Oh man, thank you. Seriously, thank you so much." Emily mouthed a silent thank you as she began installing the car seat, her hands still shaking slightly from the confrontation. James nodded and was about to sit back down when he felt a cold stare burning into the side of his head. He looked up and met Rebecca's gaze. There was no gratitude in her eyes. There was only fury. Her face had darkened like a thundercloud, her lips pressed into a thin white line. He had not helped, he had interfered. He had solved a problem she was creating, and in doing so, he had undermined her authority in front of her audience. Rebecca's anger was a tangible force radiating toward James Wilson. To her, he wasn't just a passenger who had helped another passenger. He was a direct challenge to her control, her already tenuous grip on the one domain where she still felt powerful. She leaned in close, her voice a venomous whisper meant only for him, but loud enough for the Foster family and Arthur Kellerman to hear. "When I am handling a situation with a passenger," she hissed, her breath smelling of stale coffee and mints, "you will sit down, you will be quiet, and you will let me do my job." "Is that clear, Sergeant?" The emphasis she placed on his rank made it sound like an insult rather than a sign of respect. James was taken aback by the sheer hostility radiating from her. In his years of military service and air marshal training, he had encountered all types of difficult people, but the naked antagonism in Rebecca's eyes was jarring. He kept his voice even, maintaining the calm demeanor that had served him well in far more dangerous situations. "Ma'am, I was just trying to help. We all want to get this plane in the air." This seemingly reasonable response was to Rebecca an act of defiance. The fact that he hadn't backed down immediately, hadn't shown proper deference to her authority, only fueled her rage. In her mind, his calm response was not respectful, it was condescending. "Don't tell me what we all want," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I've been doing this job for 15 years. I know what needs to happen for a safe departure." James nodded, still maintaining his composure. "Of course. Safety is the priority." Arthur Kellerman, sitting next to James, shifted uncomfortably. As a corporate attorney, he was trained to recognize when situations were escalating unnecessarily. He glanced between James and Rebecca, noting the growing tension, and subtly reached for his phone in his jacket pocket. "Ma'am," James tried again, his tone respectful but firm. "The bag is secure. The bin is closed properly. There's no safety issue here." As James spoke, his mind flashed back to a training exercise from his air marshal preparation. The instructor had emphasized that sometimes the real threats on an aircraft weren't the obvious ones. Sometimes they were crew members whose emotional instability could compromise safety protocols. "Watch for excessive rigidity," the instructor had said. Someone more concerned with enforcing rules than addressing the actual safety situation. Rebecca's behavior was raising all those warning flags. Rebecca stepped closer, invading his personal space. Her next words were delivered with a quiet intensity that nonetheless carried to several rows around them. You don't get to decide what's a safety issue on my aircraft. When I give an instruction, it's to be followed immediately and without question. That's how it works up here. Are we clear? The passengers in the surrounding rows had fallen silent, many watching the confrontation with uncomfortable fascination. Emily Foster had finished installing the car seat and was now holding Lily, who had quieted down, seemingly sensing the tension in the air. James took a slow breath. He had been in far more threatening situations, faced down actual dangers that made this interaction seem trivial by comparison. Yet there was something deeply unsettling about the irrational hostility being directed at him. I understand the importance of following crew instructions, he said carefully. But with all due respect, I was simply helping another passenger with their luggage. The situation is resolved and we can all continue with the boarding process. Rebecca's eyes narrowed further. In her mind, each measured word from James was further evidence of his disrespect. She had needed him to back down to acknowledge her absolute authority. Instead, he was being reasonable, which to her fraying nerves felt like the ultimate provocation. "Stand up," she demanded suddenly. "Get out of your seat right now." James blinked, surprised by the directive. "Ma'am, you heard me. Stand up. I want to see your boarding pass." Arthur Kellerman's eyebrows shot up, and he exchanged a glance with Philip Martinez across the aisle, who was now openly watching the situation unfold. Slowly, James stood reaching into his pocket for his boarding pass. He handed it to Rebecca, who snatched it from his hand and made a show of scrutinizing it closely. 22B, she read aloud. Middle seat. She looked up at him with a triumphant gleam in her eye. "You're leaning into the aisle. That's a safety violation during boarding. Return to your seat and stay there until we reach cruising altitude." It was a petty and technically inaccurate assertion. James had only stood to help with the luggage and was now standing at her direct request, but it was the only leverage she could find in the moment. James, recognizing the irrationality of the situation, but trained to de-escalate rather than confront, simply nodded. "Yes, ma'am." He began to sit down, but Rebecca wasn't finished. The fact that he had complied so readily only irritated her further. There was no satisfaction in winning if your opponent didn't fight back, if they didn't acknowledge your victory. "I could have you removed from this flight for interfering with crew member duties," she added, her voice carrying through the now silent cabin. "Consider this your final warning." Around them, passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. The atmosphere had grown thick with tension. In row 25, a woman whispered to her husband, "What is her problem?" He was just helping. The husband shushed her, not wanting to become the next target of the flight attendant's ire. James sat back in his seat, his expression unreadable. Years of military discipline allowed him to maintain his composure, but inside a slow burn of indignation was beginning to build. Not for himself, he had faced far worse, but for the principle of the matter. For the young family who had been unnecessarily stressed. For the atmosphere of fear that Rebecca was creating in what should have been a routine flight. From his training as an air marshal, he knew that crew members who lost emotional control posed their own kind of security risk. They created tension, divided attention from real threats, and potentially made bad decisions under pressure. He made a mental note to observe Rebecca's behavior throughout the flight, assessing whether it constituted a genuine security concern. For now, though, he would follow procedure, comply, de-escalate, observe. Rebecca, having made her point to the entire cabin, turned to walk away. But as she did, she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for James and those immediately around him to hear, "Typical." They never know their place. Rebecca's bitter muttering might have been the end of it. She could have walked away maintaining the fragile professionalism of the cabin, and Flight 557 might have departed on its delayed schedule without further incident. But something inside Rebecca Walsh had broken loose a dam of frustration, resentment, and prejudice that had been building for years. She took 3 steps down the aisle, then stopped. The silence in the cabin seemed to pull at her, demanding something more definitive, some final word that would cement her authority once and for all. She turned back toward James Wilson, who sat silently in his seat, his military bearing evident even in his stillness. She looked him up and down, her eyes lingering on his dark skin, then his uniform, as if the two were a baffling contradiction. Her gaze was dismissive, evaluating, and openly contemptuous. It was a look James had encountered before, the look of someone who couldn't quite reconcile his blackness with his uniform, his authority, his existence in a space they considered exclusively theirs. Honestly, she said, her voice now rising for all to hear, it's always your kind that has trouble with simple instructions. The words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. A collective gasp rippled through the surrounding rows. Emily Foster instinctively covered her daughter's ears, though the infant was far too young to understand the venom being spewed. Ryan Foster looked horrified, his mouth slightly open in shock. Arthur Kellerman, who had been discreetly holding his phone low against his leg, now raised it slightly, ensuring the camera was capturing what was unfolding. His legal mind had already processed that what he was witnessing had crossed from a mere customer service issue into something much more serious. Sarah Johnson, the pediatric nurse across the aisle, audibly inhaled. Philip Martinez slowly removed his earbuds, staring at Rebecca with undisguised disgust. Your kind. The phrase echoed in the confined space of the aircraft cabin, its meaning unmistakable to everyone present. It wasn't just about passengers who didn't follow instructions. It was about race, about prejudice, about a worldview that categorized people based on the color of their skin. James felt a hot flush of anger rise from his chest. He had been shot at, had faced down threats far more real than this woman. But the casual, demeaning racism of her comment, delivered so publicly while he was in the uniform of the country he served, struck a nerve deep and raw. In his mind flashed a memory from 6 years earlier, being denied entry to an officers' club in San Antonio, despite his military ID, the doorman insisting he must be at the wrong place, suggesting that perhaps he was looking for the enlisted club where his people usually went. The memory stung not because of the doorman's ignorance, but because of the other officers who had witnessed it and said nothing. In his 15 years of service, including deployments where he had put his life on the line, he had encountered racism both subtle and overt. He had learned to navigate it, to compartmentalize it, to focus on the mission rather than the ignorance. But here in this moment, the mission and the ignorance were colliding in a way he couldn't ignore. He took a slow, deliberate breath, his training in de-escalation kicking in. He would not give her the satisfaction of a reaction. He would not be the angry black man she was clearly trying to provoke. He knew that anything he said or did now would be scrutinized, interpreted through the lens of prejudice that she and perhaps others viewed him through. James looked her dead in the eye and said, his voice dangerously quiet, ma'am. That was entirely uncalled for. I suggest you walk away and check your attitude. The cabin had gone completely silent. Even the ambient noises of the aircraft, the hum of the ventilation system, the occasional thunk of baggage being loaded in the hold below seemed muted in the wake of Rebecca's comment and James's measured response. Gabriela Ramirez, who had been attending to the first-class cabin, appeared at the front of the economy section, drawn by the unusual silence. She took in the scene, Rebecca standing rigid in the aisle, James sitting calmly but with evident tension, and the shocked expressions of the surrounding passengers. Rebecca Gabriella called tentatively. Is everything okay back here? We're almost ready for door closure. Rebecca didn't turn to acknowledge her junior colleague. Her attention was fixed entirely on James Wilson, on his calm defiance, on his refusal to be cowed by her authority or her bigotry. For her, this was the ultimate insult, a black passenger in a soldier suit telling her what to do on her plane. Okay, she repeated, her voice tight with building rage. No, everything is not okay. We have passengers who think they can override my authority, who think their uniform gives them special privileges. Several rows ahead, an older man in a business suit spoke up. The only one creating a problem here is you, miss. That was an inappropriate comment. "Sir, I didn't ask for your input," Rebecca snapped, not taking her eyes off James. "This is between me and this individual." Her hesitation before the word individual spoke volumes. It was clear she had stopped herself from saying something even more offensive. For James, the situation had evolved from an annoyance to a genuine concern. As an air marshal, he was trained to identify threats to flight safety. Crew members were supposed to be the last line of defense in the cabin, the ones passengers could rely on in an emergency. A flight attendant who was emotionally unstable, who was antagonizing passengers and creating a hostile environment, represented a different kind of security threat, one that could potentially compromise the crew's ability to respond effectively in a crisis. He remained silent, maintaining eye contact with Rebecca, assessing the level of threat she posed. Not to him personally, he could handle far worse than verbal abuse, but to the overall safety and security of the flight. Rebecca's world had shrunk to this one confrontation, this one passenger who refused to submit to her authority. All her frustrations, her recent divorce, her mounting credit card debt, her feeling that her life hadn't turned out the way she'd planned, coalesced into a single point of white-hot rage. In the moment before the unthinkable happened, there was a strange clarity in Rebecca Walsh's mind. She saw herself as if from a distance, a professional woman in a crisp uniform facing down insubordination, maintaining order on her aircraft. In her distorted perception, she wasn't about to commit assault. She was about to deliver necessary discipline to maintain her authority. The reality, of course, was far different. She was a flight attendant who had already crossed multiple lines of professionalism and human decency, now teetering on the edge of an action that would destroy her career and alter her life forever. James Wilson could see it coming. His training as both a soldier and an air marshal had honed his ability to read body language to anticipate hostile actions before they occurred. He saw the slight shift in Rebecca's posture, the tightening of her jaw, the almost imperceptible leaning forward. He could have moved, could have blocked the blow that was coming, but his training also told him something else. Sometimes the best response to a threat is to let it play out, to allow the aggressor to fully reveal themselves before taking action. In a move that shocked everyone, including herself, Rebecca drew back her hand and slapped him. The sound was a sharp, ugly crack that echoed through the suddenly silent cabin. It wasn't a playful tap or a gesture of frustration. It was a full-force, open-palmed strike across the face, delivered with all the pent-up rage and bitterness that had been building inside Rebecca Walsh for years. James's head snapped to the side from the impact, more from surprise than force. The red mark began to bloom immediately on his cheek, stark against his dark skin. For a heartbeat, there was absolute stillness. The fussy baby stopped crying. The chatter ceased. Every eye was locked on row 22, on the tableau of violence that had just played out in what should have been the mundane setting of a commercial airliner. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. For some witnesses, the moment expanded, allowing them to register every detail, the look of shock on nearby passengers' faces, the slight tremor in Rebecca's hand as it returned to her side, the absolute stillness of James Wilson as he slowly turned his head back to face his attacker. For others, it was a blur, a surreal interruption to what should have been a routine flight, their brains struggling to process that they had just witnessed a uniformed flight attendant physically assault a uniformed member of the military. Arthur Kellerman's phone captured it all: the approach, the slap, the aftermath. His hand was remarkably steady as he continued filming, documenting what he knew would become evidence in what was surely going to be a significant legal case. As a corporate attorney, he had seen many instances of workplace misconduct, but never something so blatant, so public, and so clearly indefensible. The Foster family was frozen in horror. Ryan instinctively placed himself slightly in front of Emily and Lily, a protective stance born of the sudden introduction of violence into their space. Emily held Lily closer, her eyes wide with shock and fear. Throughout the cabin, passengers reacted with varying degrees of outrage and disbelief. Several had their phones out now, recording the aftermath of what had just occurred. Sarah Johnson had her hand over her mouth in shock. Philip Martinez was halfway out of his seat as if preparing to intervene if the situation escalated further. At the front of the economy section, Gabriela Ramirez stood paralyzed, her training having never prepared her for a scenario where another crew member was the aggressor. Her mind raced trying to recall protocol for crew misconduct, but coming up empty. This was so far outside the boundaries of normal operations that there was no checkbox, no procedure to follow. And in the center of it all, James Wilson slowly turned his head back, a red mark already blooming on his cheek. His eyes were no longer tired. They were cold, hard, and utterly focused. He didn't say a word. He just stared at Rebecca. In that moment, Rebecca Walsh, high on adrenaline and righteous fury, had no idea that she had just sealed her own fate. She had slapped a passenger. She had slapped a soldier. But she had also just assaulted a sworn federal officer and the clock on her career. Her freedom and her life as she knew it had just started ticking down. 5 minutes was all it would take. The slap echoed with a finality that left no room for interpretation. It was an act of pure, unrestrained aggression. Rebecca stood panting slightly, her hand still tingling, a triumphant, wild look in her eyes. She expected fear, or perhaps an angry outburst that would justify her calling for security to have him dragged off the plane. She expected to be validated in her power. She got none of it. James Wilson didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. The hot anger he felt was instantly caged and locked away, replaced by a chillingly calm professionalism that was far more unnerving than any shouted threat could have been. His training, honed in far more dangerous arenas, took over completely. The target was no longer a flight attendant. It was a threat to the security and stable operation of a federal conveyance. Assess, de-escalate, control. The slap echoed with a finality that left no room for interpretation. It was an act of pure, unrestrained aggression that crossed every conceivable line of professional conduct and human decency. Rebecca Walsh stood panting slightly, her hand still tingling, a triumphant, wild look in her eyes. She expected fear, or perhaps an angry outburst that would justify her calling for security to have him dragged off the plane. She expected to be validated in her power. She got none of it. Master Sergeant James Wilson didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. The hot anger he felt was instantly caged and locked away, replaced by a chillingly calm professionalism that was far more unnerving than any shouted threat could have been. His training, honed in far more dangerous arenas, took over completely. The target was no longer a flight attendant. It was a threat to the security and stable operation of a federal conveyance. Assess, de-escalate, control. He slowly and deliberately unbuckled his seatbelt for the second time. He stood up his 6'2" frame, seeming to fill the entire aisle, dwarfing Rebecca. He didn't move toward her, but his sheer presence made her take an involuntary step back. The triumphant look on her face began to curdle into confusion, then a flicker of fear. This was not the reaction she had anticipated. The man before her wasn't cowering or yelling. He was composed, controlled, and somehow more commanding in his silence than she had been in her rage. Arthur Kellerman was still discreetly filming his corporate lawyer's mind, already cataloging the potential legal ramifications of what he was witnessing. Emily Foster had turned Lily's face away from the confrontation, shielding her daughter from the tension in the cabin. Ryan Foster watched with a mixture of concern and fascination, ready to protect his family if necessary, but sensing that the immediate danger had somehow shifted. "What do you think you're doing?" Rebecca stammered, trying to regain her footing. "Sit down. That's it. I'm calling the captain. We're having you removed." "That won't be necessary." James said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "But you are correct. I do need to speak with the captain immediately." He turned his back on her, a gesture of such complete dismissal that it stunned her more than the slap had stunned him. He addressed Gabriela Ramirez, who had watched the entire exchange with wide, horrified eyes from her position at the front of the economy cabin. Miss James said, his tone polite but firm. "Please inform the captain that a security situation has occurred in the cabin involving a crew member, and I need access to the flight deck now." Rebecca let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You need access? You think you can just demand to see the captain? Who in the hell do you think you are?" James didn't even look at her. His focus remained on Gabriela. The young flight attendant was frozen, caught between her enraged superior and this impossibly calm soldier. Miss James repeated a hint of steel entering his voice. "This is a non-negotiable, time-sensitive security directive. Get the captain." The official-sounding language, the unwavering confidence, the sheer intensity of his gaze. It was enough. Gabriela nodded wordlessly and hurried toward the front of the plane, disappearing behind the curtain that separated the galley from the cockpit door. Rebecca was practically vibrating with rage. "A security directive. You're delusional. You assault me with your insubordination, and now you're making threats. You're finished. You'll be lucky if you're not dishonorably discharged after this." James remained silent, standing like a statue in the aisle, his eyes fixed on the cockpit door. The passengers were whispering furiously now, phones up the story spreading through the cabin like wildfire. The Foster family had pulled Lily close, looking terrified at the escalating situation. Arthur Kellerman continued to film, capturing Rebecca's escalating tirade and James's unnerving calm. Throughout the cabin, a strange shift had occurred. Passengers who had been watching with the detached interest of bystanders now felt invested, involved. Many had their phones out recording. Others were texting or calling people outside the plane, sharing real-time updates about the unfolding drama. A few were on social media, the first tweets and posts about Monarch flight attendant slap soldier already beginning to circulate. James remained outwardly calm, but his mind was racing through security protocols. Every air marshal carried the responsibility of determining what constituted a threat to flight safety. Usually that meant assessing passengers for signs of hostile intent or impairment. Rarely did it involve evaluating a crew member. But Rebecca's escalating behavior, the racial comment, the physical assault, the continued aggressive posture had crossed a threshold. A flight attendant who could not control her emotions represented a legitimate safety concern, especially if an actual emergency were to occur during the flight. After what felt like an eternity but was likely less than a minute, Gabriela reappeared. Behind her was First Officer Adam Weiss, a man in his late 20s with a serious expression. He looked from the fuming Rebecca to the stoic James, taking in the scene with the rapid assessment skills of a pilot trained to evaluate situations quickly. "I'm First Officer Weiss," he said. "What seems to be the problem here?" "This passenger." Rebecca spat, pointing a trembling finger at James, became aggressive. "Interfered with my duties and is now making delusional demands to enter the cockpit. He needs to be restrained and removed from my aircraft." First Officer Weiss looked at James, at the crisp uniform, the raw red mark on his cheek, and the absolute lack of aggression in his posture. Something didn't add up. The man before him didn't look like a threat. He looked like someone very much in control of himself despite having been physically assaulted. "Sir, is this true?" Weiss asked. Before James could answer, he took a half-step forward, closing the distance to the first officer. He spoke in a low voice intended only for Weiss. First Officer Weiss James began. "I am Master Sergeant James Wilson, United States Air Force, but that's not my relevant designation right now." The tension in the cabin of Flight 557 had reached a breaking point. Rebecca Walsh stood rigid with anger, her authority challenged in a way she had never experienced. James Wilson maintained his calm composure, though the red mark on his cheek was a vivid reminder of the line that had been crossed. The passengers had become a silent audience to a drama none of them had expected when boarding their flight to Seattle. First Officer Adam Weiss looked between the two central figures, trying to make sense of the situation. As the second in command of the aircraft, he had responsibility for cabin safety, but nothing in his training had prepared him for a scenario where a crew member was the apparent aggressor. His instinct was to support his colleague, but the evidence before him, the calm soldier with a handprint on his face versus the visibly agitated flight attendant, made that position difficult to maintain. Sir Weiss addressed James, keeping his voice steady and professional. "I understand there's been an incident. Can you explain to me exactly what you're requesting?" James maintained direct eye contact with the first officer. "I need to speak with Captain Donovan immediately regarding a serious security matter that directly impacts this flight." Rebecca interjected, her voice shrill. "This is ridiculous. He's manipulating the situation. I was maintaining order in the cabin when he repeatedly interfered with my duties and became belligerent." Several passengers immediately reacted to this characterization. "That's not what happened at all," called out a middle-aged woman from row 25. "She's the one who was aggressive. I saw the whole thing," added Philip Martinez from across the aisle. "She slapped him for no reason." "I've got it on video," Arthur Kellerman stated calmly, holding up his phone. The flight attendant made a racist comment and then physically assaulted this Air Force officer. Rebecca turned, scanning the faces of the passengers, looking for any sign of support or agreement. She found none. The unified front of passenger accounts clearly unsettled her, but she doubled down. "They're exaggerating," she insisted to Weiss. "This is a coordinated attempt to undermine my authority. This passenger," she pointed at James, "has been disruptive since he boarded. He needs to be removed from the flight before we depart." First Officer Weiss looked increasingly uncomfortable. The situation was escalating beyond his immediate authority to resolve. "Sir," he said to James, "perhaps we could discuss this in the forward galley." "No," James said firmly. "What I need to discuss involves flight security protocols that can only be addressed with the captain, and it needs to happen now." There was something in James's tone, a quiet authority, a certainty that gave Weiss pause. This wasn't the behavior of a disruptive passenger. This was something else entirely. Gabriela Ramirez, who had been standing silently nearby, finally spoke up. "First Officer, I saw what happened. Ms. Walsh did slap him. It wasn't provoked." Rebecca's head snapped toward her junior colleague, her expression a mixture of shock and betrayal. "Gabriela, that is completely inappropriate. You're undermining a senior crew member in front of passengers." "I'm stating what I observed," Gabriela replied, her voice trembling slightly but gaining strength. "As a crew member, I'm obligated to report safety concerns, and your behavior right now is concerning me." The intervention from another crew member seemed to shift something in Weiss's assessment of the situation. He studied James more carefully, noting the military bearing, the controlled demeanor, and the absolute conviction in his request. Sir Weiss said to James, "I need to understand exactly why this requires immediate access to the captain." James glanced around at the crowded cabin, then back to Weiss. "This is a matter that falls under federal security protocols. I can't discuss it further in the open cabin." Rebecca rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh, for God's sake! Now he's claiming to be some kind of security expert. This is absurd." But Weiss was no longer paying attention to Rebecca. Something in James's phrasing had triggered his pilot's instinct for recognizing genuine security concerns. The specific mention of federal protocols was not language a typical passenger would use. "Wait here," Weiss said to James. "I'll speak with the captain." Rebecca stepped forward, positioning herself between Weiss and the path to the cockpit. "Adam, you can't seriously be entertaining this. He's manipulating you. This is exactly how these people operate." The renewed racial undertone in her comment was not lost on anyone in the vicinity. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the cabin. Weiss's expression hardened. "Rebecca," he said quietly but firmly, "I need you to step back and let me do my job." "Your job is to support your crew," she hissed. My job is the safety and security of this aircraft, Weiss countered. And right now I'm concerned about your state of mind and its impact on that safety. It was a decisive moment. Rebecca's face flushed with anger and humiliation as she realized the first officer was siding against her. Fine, she spat. Go ahead. Believe him over me. But when this backfires, remember I warned you. Weiss turned and headed toward the cockpit, leaving Gabriella to monitor the situation in the cabin. The young flight attendant positioned herself near James but maintained a respectful distance, her expression a mixture of concern and professional focus. Rebecca retreated several steps down the aisle but remained within earshot, her arms crossed defensively across her chest. The red flush of anger on her face had been replaced by a pale tension as the realization that she might have seriously misjudged the situation began to dawn on her. After a brief moment at the cockpit door, First Officer Weiss returned. His demeanor had subtly shifted. There was a new formality, a heightened awareness in his movements. Sir, he said to James, the captain would like to speak with you. A ripple of surprised whispers spread through the cabin. It was highly unusual for a passenger to be granted access to the cockpit, especially with heightened security protocols in place since 9/11. Rebecca stepped forward again. This is completely irregular. You can't just... Rebecca Weiss cut her off, his voice now carrying the unmistakable tone of command. Please return to the aft galley and wait there until further notice. That's an order from the captain. The public rebuke silenced her momentarily. She stared at Weiss, then at James, her expression flickering between rage and the first stirrings of genuine fear. James followed Weiss toward the front of the aircraft, maintaining a composed posture despite the hundreds of eyes following his movement. As they reached the forward galley, Weiss turned to him with a questioning look. Before I open this door, I need to know exactly who you are, Weiss said quietly. James nodded once, then reached into his breast pocket. From his breast pocket, the one place he hadn't been slapped, James smoothly produced a small black leather wallet. He flipped it open. Inside, behind a clear plastic window, was not a military ID, but a set of credentials that made the young first officer's blood run cold. The ID was from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Emblazoned across the top were the words Federal Air Marshal Service. First Officer Adam Weiss's eyes widened. He stared at the credentials, then up at James's hard, serious face. The entire situation snapped into a terrifying new focus. This wasn't a passenger dispute. This wasn't even an unpleasant incident involving a service member. This was a federal matter. The man in front of him wasn't just a soldier. He was an undercover law enforcement officer with supreme authority on any aircraft in U.S. airspace. Agent Wilson James said, his voice a near whisper. I have identified a direct and immediate threat to the safety and security of this flight. The threat is your lead flight attendant, Ms. Walsh. She is emotionally unstable, has committed assault, and is no longer fit to perform her duties. I am now officially taking control of the security of this cabin. I need to speak with Captain Donovan in the cockpit right now to determine the disposition of this aircraft. Weiss swallowed hard, his mind racing through emergency protocols. An agitated flight attendant was one thing. An assault on a passenger was serious, but an assault on a federal air marshal was a 5-alarm fire that required immediate and decisive action. Yes, sir. Right this way, Sir Weiss said, his voice suddenly filled with a deference that would have been comical under different circumstances. He knocked on the cockpit door, waited for the security protocol to be completed, and then gestured for James to enter as the reinforced door swung open. James stepped through the threshold and into the cockpit of Flight 557. The heavy door clicked shut behind him, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. Back in the main cabin, Rebecca Walsh stood alone in the aisle, her face a mask of disbelief. The first officer had called him Sir. He had let him into the cockpit. The world had just turned upside down. The power dynamic had shifted so violently it gave her vertigo. Gabriella approached her cautiously. "Rebecca, I think you should come with me to the aft galley. We need to give them space to resolve this." Rebecca stared at the younger woman, struggling to process what was happening. "What is going on?" she demanded. "Who is he? Why would they let him in there?" Before Gabriella could respond, a passenger from row 27 spoke up. "He's an air marshal. My brother works for TSA. I recognize the wallet." The words rippled through the cabin like an electric current. "Air marshal," someone repeated. She slapped a federal agent, another whispered. The blood drained from Rebecca's face as the implications began to sink in. Air marshals were federal law enforcement officers specifically tasked with protecting aircraft from threats. They had nearly absolute authority in the air, and she had just physically assaulted one. "That's not... He can't be..." Rebecca stuttered, but the conviction in her denial was crumbling rapidly. "He's just a soldier." Arthur Kellerman shook his head slightly. "Many air marshals have military backgrounds, Ms. Walsh. They don't advertise who they are. That's rather the point of having undercover security on flights." Rebecca turned to Gabriella, desperation now evident in her eyes. "Did you know? Did everyone know except me?" "No one knew," Gabriella said quietly. "That's how it works. But Rebecca, what matters right now is that you assaulted a passenger. Whether he's an air marshal or not, that's a serious violation." "I didn't," Rebecca began, but the words died on her lips as she looked around at the sea of faces staring back at her. Some with pity, others with disgust, but all with the certainty of witnesses who knew exactly what they had seen. 5 minutes had not yet passed since the slap. The plane was still attached to the gate, the engines humming softly. But for Rebecca Walsh, her flight, her career, and her entire life had just been irrevocably grounded. She just didn't know the full extent of it yet. In the cockpit, Captain Michael Donovan turned in his seat as James entered. His weathered face registered surprise, then concern as he noted the red mark on James's cheek. "What in God's name is going on back there?" he asked. "Weiss tells me we have a serious situation." James stood at a respectful distance, maintaining proper cockpit protocol despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Captain Donovan, my name is James Wilson. I'm a federal air marshal." He presented his credentials again. Donovan, unlike his younger co-pilot, didn't show any shock. He'd been flying long enough to have encountered FAMs on his flights before, though they were almost always invisible present but undetected exactly as designed. He took the credentials, examined them closely, noting the ID number and the seal of the Department of Homeland Security. They were legitimate. He handed them back. "All right, Agent Wilson," the captain said, his demeanor shifting. The man before him was no longer just a passenger or a soldier. He was a federal partner in the security of this aircraft. "Report." The inside of the cockpit was a sanctuary of calm professionalism, a stark contrast to the chaos brewing in the cabin. The soft glow of instrument panels illuminated the faces of Captain Michael Donovan, First Officer Adam Weiss, and James Wilson as they conferred in the confined space of the flight deck. At approximately 16:05 hours during the final stages of boarding, James began his voice. "The epitome of military and police precision. Your lead flight attendant, Ms. Rebecca Walsh, initiated a verbal confrontation with me after I assisted another passenger with their carry-on luggage." James recounted the events concisely, without emotion or embellishment. He detailed Rebecca's escalating hostility, her blocking of the aisle, and her refusal to de-escalate despite multiple opportunities. She then made a statement I deemed to be racially motivated, James continued. She said, "It's always your kind that has trouble with simple instructions." Captain Donovan's eyes narrowed. That was bad. Incredibly bad. It spoke to a profound lack of judgment and potential discriminatory behavior that violated both airline policy and civil rights protections. When I advised her that her comment was uncalled for and that she should walk away, James went on, his voice unwavering. She responded by striking me across the face with an open hand. The captain and first officer stared at the red handprint on James's cheek, which was now impossible to unsee. "She assaulted you," Donovan stated flatly, the full weight of the word sinking in. "Yes, sir," James confirmed. "She committed an unprovoked assault on a passenger who also happens to be a federal officer in the performance of his duties in a secure federal area." James paused, allowing the severity of the situation to register before continuing. "More critically, from your perspective as pilot in command, her actions demonstrate a complete loss of emotional control. She is volatile, unprofessional, and in my official assessment, she constitutes a direct and immediate flight safety risk. An individual this unstable cannot be trusted with the critical safety and security duties of a flight attendant at 35,000 feet. Captain Donovan leaned back in his chair, processing the catastrophic implications. This wasn't something that could be smoothed over. This wasn't a personality clash or a customer service issue. This was a federal crime and a massive safety breach. The regulations were crystal clear. "What's your recommendation?" Agent Donovan asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it. "My recommendation is that this aircraft does not take off with Ms. Walsh as a member of the crew," James said firmly. "She needs to be removed from the plane and an incident report filed immediately. From a law enforcement perspective, she needs to be met by authorities at the gate. Assault on a federal officer is not a customer service complaint." First Officer Weiss, who had been listening silently, finally spoke up. "Captain, half the cabin has their phones out." A passenger in 22C appeared to be recording the entire interaction, including the slap. "There's going to be video of this." Donovan swore under his breath. This was already public. The corporate fallout would be immense. But his primary responsibility wasn't to the Monarch Airlines stock price. It was to the safety of every soul on this plane. And James was right. There was no scenario in which he could responsibly take off with Rebecca Walsh on board. "So, we're grounded," Donovan said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "I believe that's the only safe course of action," Sir James confirmed. "Ms. Walsh's behavior poses a clear risk to the operational safety of this flight. Even setting aside the assault and the legal implications, her emotional state makes her unfit for safety-critical duties." Donovan turned to his first officer. "Weiss, what's the situation in the cabin right now, tenth sir? The passengers are aware something serious is happening. Many are recording. Miss..." Walsh was still in the main aisle when I escorted Agent Wilson to the cockpit. Gabriella was attempting to move her to the aft galley. Donovan nodded, thinking through the immediate steps needed. "All right, here's how we'll handle this. First, I need to contact operations and inform them we have a crew issue that requires immediate attention and possible law enforcement response." He reached for the radio handset, toggling to the company frequency rather than the general ATC channel. "Monarch Operations. This is Captain Donovan on Flight 557 at Gate C-34. We have a situation requiring immediate response. I need a station manager and law enforcement to meet the aircraft. We have an incident involving crew misconduct that will require removal of a crew member and possible flight cancellation." The response came back promptly. "Flight 557, this is Operations. Acknowledge your request. We're dispatching the station manager and security to your location. Can you provide additional details on the nature of the incident?" Donovan glanced at James, who gave a slight nod. "Operations, we have had an assault incident involving a flight attendant and a passenger who is a federal air marshal. The situation is contained, but we need immediate assistance at the gate." There was a brief pause. Then understood Captain. "Law enforcement has been notified. They'll meet you at the gate in approximately 5 minutes." Donovan replaced the handset and turned back to James. "Agent Wilson, as the pilot in command, I'm formally requesting your continued assistance in maintaining cabin security until law enforcement arrives. I'm also going to need a formal statement from you for our incident report." "Of course," Captain James replied. "I'll provide whatever assistance you need." Donovan turned to his first officer. "Weiss, I need you to go back into the cabin and inform Gabriella to secure Ms. Walsh in the aft galley away from passengers. Then make an announcement that we're experiencing a delay due to a crew issue. Don't provide specifics. We don't need to inflame the situation further." "Yes, sir," Weiss responded, moving toward the cockpit door. "Wait," Donovan called. "Before you go out there, let's be clear on the chain of events that will follow. Once law enforcement arrives, Ms. Walsh will be removed from the aircraft. After that, we'll need to assess whether we can operate this flight. We'll be down a flight attendant, and depending on availability of a replacement, we might have to cancel." Weiss nodded his understanding. "What about the passengers? Some of them are witnesses to the assault. We'll deal with that after Walsh is off the plane," Donovan said firmly. "One crisis at a time." As Weiss exited the cockpit, Donovan turned back to James. "Agent Wilson, I want to apologize on behalf of Monarch Airlines for what happened to you today. That's not who we are as a company, and it's certainly not the standard of professionalism we expect from our crew." James nodded in acknowledgement. "I understand, Captain. Unfortunately, in my line of work, I've seen how stress and personal issues can cause people to act in ways they might not ordinarily behave. The important thing now is ensuring the safety of everyone on board." Donovan studied the air marshal for a moment, impressed by his composure and professionalism in the face of such a personal attack. "May I ask you something off the record?" "Go ahead," James replied. "You could have identified yourself immediately after the incident. Why didn't you?" James considered the question carefully. "In most situations, maintaining cover is protocol. Revealing my identity unnecessarily compromises future operations. But more importantly, Captain, this wasn't just about me being an air marshal. Ms. Walsh's behavior would have been unacceptable regardless of who was on the receiving end. The fact that she happened to assault a federal officer just escalates the legal consequences." As he spoke, James reflected on a similar incident from 2 years earlier when he had witnessed a flight attendant his protocol. Revealing my identity unnecessarily compromises future operations. But more importantly, Captain, this wasn't just about me being an air marshal. Ms. Walsh's behavior would have been unacceptable regardless of who was on the receiving end. The fact that she happened to assault a federal officer just escalates the legal consequences. As he spoke, James reflected on a similar incident from 2 years earlier when he had witnessed a flight attendant on another airline berating an elderly Asian passenger. He had remained silent then, following protocol to stay undercover unless there was an immediate safety threat. The memory had haunted him, the passenger's humiliation, the crew member's unchecked power. Today had been different. Today, the threat to flight safety had been clear and present. Donovan nodded thoughtfully. "Fair enough. Well, we're going to handle this by the book." He reached for the PA microphone, preparing to address the cabin. "I need to inform the passengers about our delay." Captain Michael Donovan held the PA microphone in his hand, weighing his words carefully. In his 3 decades of flying commercial aircraft, he had made hundreds of announcements about delays, weather issues, and mechanical problems. But he had never had to tell passengers that their flight was being grounded because a member of his crew had assaulted a federal agent. He pressed the button and his calm, authoritative voice filled the cabin. "Folks, this is your captain speaking from the flight deck. I apologize for the delay. Due to an unforeseen security issue involving a member of the flight crew, we will be unable to depart at this time. We will be shutting down the aircraft and returning to the gate. I repeat, due to a crew-related security issue, we are returning to the gate." He paused, letting the information sink in before continuing. "We ask that you please remain in your seats until the seatbelt sign is turned off. We will provide you with more information as soon as we have it. Cabin crew, prepare for return to stand." In the main cabin, a wave of groans and confused murmurs spread through the passengers. Most had witnessed at least part of the confrontation between Rebecca and James, but hearing the official confirmation that the incident was severe enough to ground the plane still came as a shock. Rebecca Walsh, who had been reluctantly ushered to the aft galley by Gabriella, felt the words hit her like a physical blow. A crew-related security issue. There was only one crew member involved in an issue. Her. The engines, which had been humming with the promise of departure, began to wind down. The low thrum that vibrated through the fuselage faded into an eerie silence. The lights flickered as the plane switched from its own power back to the ground supply. Rebecca's face went pale. The blood drained from it, leaving her looking shallow and sick under the harsh cabin lighting. The reality of the situation was beginning to crash down on her with the force of a tidal wave. "This can't be happening," she whispered more to herself than to Gabriella, who stood a cautious distance away. "They're grounding the flight because of me, Rebecca." Gabriella said softly, "You hit a passenger. That alone would be grounds for immediate removal from duty. But from what I'm gathering, the situation is even more serious." "I was just doing my job," Rebecca insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. "He was undermining my authority. You saw how he was interfering. I saw him help that family with their bag." Gabriella replied, her voice firm but not unkind. "And then I saw you escalate the situation unnecessarily. And yes, I saw you slap him." Rebecca looked at her junior colleague, searching for any sign of sympathy or support. Finding none, she felt a fresh wave of panic. They can't just kick me off the flight. I'm senior crew. I have rights. The union? The union can't help you assault someone." Rebecca Gabriella cut in. "This isn't about seniority or procedures. You physically attacked a passenger in front of witnesses." In the main cabin, passengers were processing the announcement with varying degrees of frustration and interest. For many business travelers, the delay meant missed connections and rescheduled meetings. For families, it was an additional stress on already challenging travel plans. But for those who had witnessed the confrontation firsthand, there was also a sense of justice being served. Arthur Kellerman, still in seat 22C, was reviewing the video he had captured on his phone. The footage was clear, unambiguous, and damning. It showed the entire sequence: Rebecca's aggressive behavior, her racist comment, the unprovoked slap, and James's calm response. Arthur, with his attorney's mind, knew exactly how devastating this evidence would be in any legal proceeding. The Foster family was trying to comfort Lily, who had begun to fuss again, sensing the tension around her. "It's okay, sweetheart," Emily whispered. "We're just going to be a little delayed." Ryan checked his phone, already looking for alternative flights. "This is probably going to be canceled," he said quietly to Emily. "After what happened, I can't imagine they'll let that flight attendant continue working." Throughout the cabin, similar conversations were taking place. Passengers speculated about what would happen next, shared their observations of the incident, and expressed their outrage at Rebecca's behavior. Many were on their phones texting friends and family about the delay and the dramatic reason behind it. "My sister's a flight attendant for Delta," one woman was saying. "She says this is absolutely unheard of. Flight attendants are trained extensively in de-escalation and passenger management. To physically strike a passenger, she's definitely fired minimum." "And did you hear what she said before she hit him?" Her seatmate responded. "You're kind." In 2025. That's not just unprofessional, it's straight up racist. Back in the aft galley, Rebecca was spiraling further into denial and panic. "This is a misunderstanding," she insisted to Gabriella. "If I could just speak to the captain, explain my side." "Rebecca." "Stop," Gabriella said firmly. "The captain has made his decision based on the facts. The best thing you can do now is cooperate and try not to make this any worse than it already is." "Worse?" Rebecca laughed bitterly. "How could it possibly be worse? They're grounding a flight because of me. My career is over. 15 years gone just like that. You made choices." Gabriella said simply, "Now there are consequences." The words hung between them, stark and unavoidable. Rebecca opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, First Officer Weiss appeared at the galley entrance. "Ms. Walsh," he said formally, "we've returned to the gate. Airport security and airline management are on their way to the aircraft. Captain Donovan has instructed that you remain here in the aft galley until they arrive." Rebecca stared at him, the last fragments of her professional facade crumbling. "Adam," she said, using his first name in a desperate attempt to establish some connection. "You know me. We've flown together a dozen times. You can't seriously believe I'm some kind of threat." Weiss's expression remained impassive. "This isn't about what I believe, Rebecca. It's about what you did. You assaulted a passenger in full view of the cabin. That passenger happens to be a federal air marshal. Those are facts, not beliefs. A federal—" Rebecca's voice trailed off as the final piece clicked into place. The calm authority, the immediate access to the cockpit, the formal security language. "The soldier is an air marshal." "Yes," Weiss confirmed. "And you assaulted him during the performance of his duties. That's a federal offense." Rebecca sagged against the galley counter, the full weight of her actions finally hitting her. Her anger, her pride, her momentary loss of control had not just cost her a job. It had potentially ruined her life. Outside the aircraft, the jet bridge was reconnected. Through the windows, passengers could see the flashing lights of security vehicles on the tarmac. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The slow, grinding taxi back to the gate was the longest journey of Rebecca Walsh's life. Every inch the plane moved felt like a turn of the screw tightening the knot of panic in her stomach. Though she was physically isolated in the aft galley, she could feel the weight of judgment from the entire aircraft pressing in on her. The passengers, now fully aware of who the crew-related security issue was, stared at her with a mixture of contempt, pity, and morbid curiosity whenever she came into view. Some openly filmed with their phones, eager to capture the downfall of Monarch Rebecca, as she was already being dubbed in real-time social media updates. She tried to retreat further into the galley, seeking some privacy in her humiliation, but the small space offered little refuge. Gabriella stood nearby, not as a colleague anymore, but as a monitor, ensuring Rebecca remained contained until the authorities arrived. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was tense and professional. Captain Donovan was on the radio with the airline's ground operations center, his language clipped and precise. "Monarch Ops, this is Monarch 557. We are returning to stand at gate C-34. I am declaring the aircraft grounded due to an irreconcilable security breach involving a cabin crew member. I need you to have a corporate security supervisor, a gate agent, and law enforcement meet the aircraft." "That's an affirmative." "I need police." First Officer Weiss was on another channel coordinating with the jet bridge operator. James Wilson stood silently in the back of the small space, his presence a constant heavy reminder of the gravity of the situation. He was no longer a victim. He was an observer, a federal witness ensuring the proper protocols were followed. When the plane finally docked with a soft bump, the finality of it was absolute. The seatbelt sign pinged off, but no one moved. The cabin was a theater, and everyone was waiting for the final act. Captain Donovan's voice came over the PA again, this time with a tone of grim resolution. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now back at the gate. For your safety and to allow the authorities to conduct their business, we ask that you please remain seated until we give the all clear. Do not stand up and do not attempt to retrieve your luggage from the overhead bins." The forward cabin door was opened by the ground staff. A moment later, 3 figures stepped onto the aircraft. The first was a stern-looking woman in a Monarch Airlines corporate suit, Diane Hernandez, the station manager. The next 2 were officers from the Atlanta International Airport Police Department. They were large, imposing, and all business. They didn't even glance at the passengers. They walked directly to the front galley where Captain Donovan met them. He spoke in a low, urgent tone, gesturing back toward the aft of the cabin where Rebecca stood frozen. Then the 2 police officers and the station manager stepped into the aisle. They walked past the first-class seats through the premium economy section and continued into the main cabin. Every eye in the plane tracked their progress. As they passed row 22, James Wilson nodded almost imperceptibly to the officers, a silent acknowledgement between law enforcement professionals. They continued to the back of the aircraft and stopped directly in front of Rebecca. The lead officer, a tall man with a salt and pepper mustache, addressed her. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried with an authority that cut through the silence. "Ma'am, are you Rebecca Walsh?" Rebecca could only nod her throat too tight to speak. "I'm Officer Davis. We need you to come with us, please." It wasn't a request. "Come with you where I have to finish my flight," she stammered, a pathetic attempt to cling to a reality that no longer existed. "Your duties on this flight are concluded." "Ms. Walsh," Diane Hernandez said, her voice like ice. "You need to come with us now. Collect your personal belongings." Rebecca looked at them, then at the rows of passengers watching her, their faces impassive, their phones still raised. This was the ultimate humiliation, the walk of shame. She who had prided herself on her authority and control was being publicly stripped of it all. She numbly retrieved her purse and her small crew bag from a storage compartment. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely grasp the zippers. As the officers turned to escort her, she caught sight of James Wilson, who had just emerged from the cockpit. He stood near the forward galley, his face a mask of professional neutrality. There was no triumph in his eyes, no satisfaction, just a quiet, resolute stillness. He had done his duty. This was merely the consequence. That look, more than anything else, broke her. The realization that to him this wasn't personal. It was procedural. She wasn't a rival he had vanquished. She was a security threat that had been neutralized. As the officers led her down the aisle toward the open door, a low murmur rippled through the plane. Someone clapped a single, sharp sound. Then another joined in, and another. It wasn't a thunderous ovation, but a scattered smattering of applause from the passengers who had witnessed her abuse. It was the soundtrack to her disgrace. Each step was an eternity. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, the patterned carpet blurring through her tears. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her back, feel the heat of her own shame as she stepped off the aircraft and onto the jet bridge, leaving her career behind on that patterned carpet. The door to Flight 557 closed behind her. Inside, once she was gone, a collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the cabin. The tension that had held everyone captive finally broke. Captain Donovan's voice came on the PA one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Monarch Airlines and from me personally, I want to offer my sincerest apologies for what you have just witnessed and for the disruption to your travel plans. The behavior you saw from one of our crew members is unacceptable and is not representative of the values or the standards of this airline. It will be dealt with to the fullest extent, I assure you." He paused, and his next words were heavy with sincerity. "Unfortunately, due to crew availability and the necessary reports, we must now file this flight. Monarch 557 to Seattle is officially canceled. Please exit the aircraft row by row when directed. Our ground staff will be at the gate to assist you with rebooking options. We are truly sorry for this inconvenience." Groans of frustration echoed through the cabin, but they were tempered with understanding. As people began to gather their things, Arthur Kellerman made his way to the front. He saw James Wilson speaking quietly with Captain Donovan. He waited patiently until they were finished. "Excuse me, Agent Wilson," Arthur said. James turned. "Yes, Arthur Kellerman," he said, extending a hand and a business card. "I'm an attorney. I was in seat 22C. I saw the whole thing. I also have a high-definition video of the entire incident, from her racist comment to the assault and her subsequent tirade. It's time-stamped and stable. If you or the U.S. Attorney's Office need a civilian witness, or this footage here is my direct line. What she did was beyond the pale." James took the card. "Thank you, Mr. Kellerman. That might be very useful. I appreciate it. It's the least I can do." Arthur said, giving a respectful nod. "Thank you for your service in more ways than one today." James simply nodded as the lawyer walked away. He was now just another passenger on a canceled flight facing the headache of rebooking. But his job here was done. The immediate threat was handled. Now the slow grinding wheels of justice and corporate karma would begin to turn for Rebecca Walsh. And they would be merciless. The jet bridge felt like a tunnel leading Rebecca Walsh into an uncertain darkness. Officer Davis and his partner walked on either side of her, not touching her, but close enough to intervene if necessary. Behind them, Diane Hernandez, the Monarch Airlines station manager, followed with brisk, efficient steps, already on her phone informing corporate headquarters of the developing situation. Rebecca walked in a daze, still struggling to process how quickly everything had unraveled. Just 30 minutes ago, she had been a respected senior flight attendant preparing for a routine flight. Now she was being escorted through the airport like a criminal. As they emerged from the jet bridge into the busy terminal, Rebecca instinctively hunched her shoulders as if trying to make herself smaller, less visible. But there was no hiding. Several passengers waiting at nearby gates had their phones out, filming the spectacle of a uniformed Monarch employee being escorted by police. "Is there somewhere more private we can go?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Officer Davis nodded. "We're taking you to the airport security office. It's just past the food court." The walk through the terminal felt endless. Rebecca was acutely aware of her uniform now a mark of shame rather than pride. The crisp navy blazer with the Monarch wings pin that she had polished just that morning now felt like a costume, a reminder of a role she would never play again. They arrived at a nondescript door marked Airport Operations, Authorized Personnel Only. Officer Davis swiped a key card and they entered a brightly lit corridor that led to a series of offices and conference rooms well away from the public areas of the terminal. Rebecca was guided into a small room with a table, several chairs, and no windows. It was neither a formal interrogation room nor a comfortable office. It existed in that sterile middle ground of administrative spaces designed for difficult conversations. "Wait here, please," Officer Davis instructed. "Someone will be with you shortly." The door closed behind them, leaving Rebecca alone with her thoughts for the first time since the incident. She sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. The silence of the room pressed in on her, broken only by the distant sound of airport announcements filtering through the walls and the pounding of her own heart in her ears. 10 minutes later, the door opened again. Diane Hernandez entered, followed by a man in a sharp suit whom Rebecca recognized as Thomas Blackwell, the head of human resources for Monarch's Atlanta hub. Behind them came Officer Davis and a woman in a dark blazer who introduced herself as Detective Sarah Williams from the Atlanta Police Department. Rebecca's stomach dropped. A detective. This wasn't just an airport security issue anymore. This was a criminal investigation. Ms. Walsh Diane began, her voice professionally neutral. "I'm sure you understand the seriousness of the situation. Before we proceed, I need to inform you that this conversation is being recorded for internal Monarch Airlines purposes." She gestured to a small device on the table. "Additionally, Detective Williams is here because a formal complaint has been filed regarding the incident on Flight 557. "A formal complaint," Rebecca repeated weakly. "All ready?" "Yes," Detective Williams confirmed. "We've received a report of assault against a federal officer." "That's a serious allegation, Ms. Walsh." Rebecca looked between them, panic rising in her chest. "I didn't know he was a federal officer. He was just a passenger. A soldier. That distinction doesn't actually matter under the law," Detective Williams said. "Assault is assault. The victim's status as a federal air marshal simply elevates the charge to the federal level." "Federal level." Rebecca's voice cracked. This was spiraling beyond anything she could have imagined. "Let's take this one step at a time," Thomas Blackwell interjected. Ms. Walsh, from an employment perspective, we need to address the immediate issue of your status with Monarch Airlines. He opened a folder and removed a single sheet of paper. Based on the preliminary report from Captain Donovan and multiple witness statements, not to mention the direct complaint from a federal air marshal, we are terminating your employment with Monarch Airlines, effective immediately. Termination. Rebecca whispered the word, landing like a physical blow. But I have my union. Your union will be notified. Diane cut her off. But let me be very clear. The collective bargaining agreement does not protect employees from termination for cause in cases of gross misconduct, which includes endangering the safety of a flight, criminal acts, and assaulting a passenger. You, Rebecca, have managed to hit the trifecta in the span of about 15 minutes. The union can't touch this. Rebecca was instructed to turn in her company ID and crew badges. As she slid them across the polished table, it felt like she was surrendering her identity. That plastic card had been her ticket to the world, a symbol of a life she thought was glamorous, a life that set her apart. Now it was just a worthless piece of plastic. What happens now? She asked, her voice small in the sterile room. From Monarch's perspective, we'll complete our internal investigation and finalize the paperwork for your termination, Thomas explained. You'll receive formal documentation by mail within 48 hours. Any final pay and accrued vacation time will be processed according to company policy. And from a law enforcement perspective, Detective Williams added, we'll be continuing our investigation. The FBI has been notified due to the federal nature of the offense. You should expect to hear from them within the next day or two. The FBI. Rebecca felt lightheaded. This is completely disproportionate. It was just a slap, Miss Walsh. Officer Davis said firmly. You physically assaulted a federal officer in the performance of his duties on a commercial aircraft. Under 18 U.S. Code, for 111, that's a federal offense, punishable by up to 8 years in federal prison. This isn't a minor incident. Rebecca fell silent, the gravity of her situation finally sinking in. This wasn't about losing a job anymore. This was about potentially losing her freedom. Do you have someone who can pick you up? Diane asked, her tone softening slightly. Despite everything, there was a flicker of human concern in her eyes. You shouldn't drive in your current state. Rebecca shook her head. I can get an Uber. All right. Diane nodded. You'll need to change out of your uniform before leaving the airport. There's a bathroom down the hall where you can do that. As the meeting concluded, Rebecca was handed a clear plastic bag containing her termination paperwork and instructions for returning any additional company property in her possession. Her wings pinned the symbol of her 15 years with the airline was placed in the bag as well. She changed in the small bathroom, folding her uniform carefully out of habit, then pausing as she realized it no longer mattered how she treated the garments. They weren't hers anymore. Nothing of this life was hers anymore. As she left the airport security area and walked back into the main terminal, Rebecca Walsh was just another civilian in street clothes, anonymous among the thousands of travelers. No one turned to look at her. No one requested her assistance or questioned her authority. She was invisible, and for the first time in her life, she wished she could stay that way forever. Back on Flight 557, the passengers had begun the process of deplaning. The mood was a complex mixture of frustration over the cancellation, lingering shock from the incident they had witnessed, and the peculiar camaraderie that emerges when strangers share an unusual experience. Captain Michael Donovan stood at the front of the aircraft, personally addressing passengers as they exited. It was an old-school gesture, a captain taking responsibility for the experience of those under his care, even when the situation had been beyond his control. I apologize for the disruption, he said repeatedly, making eye contact with each person. Our team at the gate will help you with rebooking. When the Foster family approached with baby Lily, who was now fussing from the prolonged confinement, Donovan's expression softened. I'm especially sorry for the little one. First flight. Yes. Emily replied, bouncing Lily gently. And probably the last for a while after this experience. Don't let today discourage you, Donovan said kindly. Most flights are uneventful, I promise. In 30 years of flying, I've never experienced anything quite like this. Ryan nodded. We understand it wasn't the airline's fault. That flight attendant was, well, she had issues. Still, we're committed to making this right, Donovan assured them. Make sure you speak with our customer service team. We'll take care of you. As the last passengers filed out, Gabriela Ramirez approached the captain. Her face showed the strain of the past hour, but she maintained her professional composure. Captain, what happens now? She asked. With the flight canceled and Rebecca... She trailed off, still processing the dramatic removal of her colleague. Now we do what airlines always do, Donovan replied. We adapt and we move forward. There will be an investigation reports to file and likely some procedural reviews. But the immediate concern is getting these passengers to their destinations. He glanced toward the gate area where Monarch staff were already setting up a makeshift rebooking station. It's going to be a long night for the gate agents. Out in the terminal, the scene at gate C-34 was controlled chaos. The sudden cancellation of a full flight to Seattle had created a logistical nightmare. Passengers crowded around the counter, anxiety and frustration evident on many faces. A supervisor had been called in to assist the regular gate staff, and additional customer service representatives were arriving with tablets to help process the rebookings more efficiently. A digital sign had been set up. Flight 557 passengers, we apologize for the inconvenience. Please form a line for rebooking assistance. Near the front of the line, Arthur Kellerman was on his phone, speaking quietly but intently. Yes, I witnessed the whole thing. No, I've never seen anything like it in all my years of business travel. I already offered my contact information to the air marshal. Yes, I have it on video. No, I'm not posting it online. This is potential evidence in a federal case. The Foster family had found a quiet corner where Emily could nurse Lily while Ryan spoke with a customer service representative who had approached them directly, recognizing that a family with an infant needed priority assistance. We can get you on the 7:45 flight to Seattle, the representative was explaining. It's the last flight tonight. We'll also provide meal vouchers for dinner while you wait. Thank you, Ryan said, genuine gratitude in his voice. That's very helpful. Meanwhile, at the back of the crowd, 2 passengers from Flight 557 were already uploading content to social media. Their voices animated as they recounted what they'd witnessed. She just straight up slapped him, one was saying into his phone. And then he turned out to be an air marshal. You can't make this stuff up. The story was beginning to spread beyond the confines of Gate C-34, rippling out into the digital world where it would soon take on a life of its own. Monarch slap and Hash flight attendant meltdown were already gaining traction on Twitter, the first viral videos appearing on TikTok and Instagram. Back at the aircraft, the cleaning crew had arrived to prepare the plane for its next assignment. They worked efficiently, resetting seatbelts, collecting abandoned items, wiping down surfaces. The ritual cleansing that readied an aircraft to begin anew as if the drama that had unfolded in its cabin had never happened. Captain Donovan watched them work for a moment, then turned to First Officer Weiss. Let's get the paperwork started. It's going to be a mountain. Weiss nodded. I've already been contacted by corporate security. They want our statements as soon as possible. Not surprising, Donovan replied. This is going to be a case study in crew management training for years to come. As they walked toward the operations office, Donovan spotted James Wilson standing near a window gazing out at the tarmac. The captain altered his course, approaching the air marshal with a respectful nod. Agent Wilson, before you go, I wanted to thank you for your professionalism today. You handled a difficult situation with remarkable restraint. James turned from the window. I appreciate that, Captain. But I was just doing my job. Well, your job prevented what could have been a much worse situation, Donovan said. If that had escalated at 35,000 feet, he didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. James nodded his understanding. I've seen how quickly things can spiral. Better to address it on the ground. Will you be all right getting to Seattle? Donovan asked. I can speak with the customer service team. Make sure you're prioritized for rebooking. No need for special treatment, James replied. I'll work it out like everyone else. Besides, he added with the faintest hint of a smile, I think I've had enough attention for one day. Donovan chuckled. Fair enough. Safe travels, then. As the captain walked away, James returned his gaze to the airport operations unfolding outside the window. Aircraft taxiing ground crew directing the choreographed ballet of commercial aviation, continuing uninterrupted despite the small drama that had just played out inside. For James Wilson, it was a reminder of the resilience of systems, of how they absorbed disruptions and continued functioning. The machine might pause briefly, but it always resumed its rhythm. In this case, the disruption had been Rebecca Walsh, and while the airline would recover and continue, her personal trajectory had been irrevocably altered. James checked his watch. He needed to call Natalie, let her know about the delay, and then find a way home. The incident would require a report, paperwork, possibly testimony. But those were concerns for tomorrow. Today, he just wanted to get back to his family. As the chaos at Gate C-34 gradually organized itself into orderly queues of passengers waiting for rebooking, James Wilson found a relatively quiet corner of the concourse. He took out his phone and dialed a number from memory. Federal Air Marshal Service Atlanta Field Office. A crisp voice answered. This is Wilson, badge number 6729. I need to speak with the supervisory air marshal in charge. One moment, please. After a brief wait, a deeper voice came on the line. Ramsey here. Wilson. What's your status, sir? I'm reporting an incident on Monarch Airlines Flight 557 Atlanta to Seattle. I've had to identify myself and intervene in a situation involving a physically aggressive flight attendant. There was a pause, then, give me the rundown. James provided a concise, detailed account of the events from the initial confrontation to Rebecca's racist comment, the assault, and the subsequent grounding of the flight. His report was methodical and unemotional, focusing on the facts rather than his personal experience of being assaulted. The flight attendant, Rebecca Walsh, has been removed from the aircraft by airport police, he concluded. Detective Sarah Williams from Atlanta PD is handling the initial investigation. And you're uninjured? Ramsey asked. Affirmative. Minor facial redness from the slap, nothing more. Good. This is going to kick up a hell of an administrative storm, Wilson. You'll need to come in and complete a formal incident report as soon as possible. The FBI will want to interview you as well, since this falls under federal jurisdiction. Understood, sir. I was scheduled to continue to Seattle today. My family is expecting me. I know, and I'm sorry about that. Ramsey said, his tone softening slightly. But we need to process this while it's fresh. The U.S. Attorney's Office will likely be involved given the nature of the offense. James sighed internally but maintained his professional demeanor. Yes, sir. I can report to the field office immediately. Do that. And Wilson, sir, good work maintaining your cover as long as you did. Many agents would have identified themselves the moment things got heated. Your restraint probably prevented a much bigger scene. Thank you, sir. After ending the call, James took a moment to collect his thoughts before making a much more difficult call. He dialed home. Natalie answered on the second ring. James, are you boarding soon? The sound of his wife's voice, warm, expectant, filled with the anticipation of his return, made the weight of the day's events suddenly heavier. Hey, Nat, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. There's been a change of plans. My flight was canceled. Canceled. Why? The weather looks fine in Seattle. James hesitated. He didn't want to worry her, but he also wouldn't lie. There was an incident on the plane before takeoff. Nothing dangerous, but it resulted in the flight being grounded. An incident. Natalie's voice sharpened with concern. What kind of incident? Were you involved? I was peripherally involved. Yes. He chose his words carefully. A crew member behaved inappropriately. I had to identify myself as an air marshal. There was a pause as Natalie absorbed this information. She understood his work well enough to know that revealing his identity was a significant step one he would only take if absolutely necessary. "James," she said slowly, "what aren't you telling me?" He sighed, knowing he couldn't shield her from the full story. The flight attendant made some racist comments toward me, and when I didn't react the way she wanted, she slapped me. "She what?" Natalie's voice rose in disbelief and anger. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Nat. Truly." It was more startling than painful. "I don't care if it didn't hurt. She assaulted you. Please tell me she was arrested. She was removed from the flight. There's an investigation underway. But listen, that's not the immediate issue. I need to go to the field office to file a report, which means I won't be making it home tonight." He could hear Natalie's deep breath, the sound of her processing her anger and disappointment. "Okay," she finally said. "I understand. Duty first as always. I'm sorry, Nat. I was really looking forward to being home tonight." "I know you were," she said, her voice softening. "Dylan will be disappointed, but he'll understand. He's proud of what you do, you know. We both are. Tell him I'll call before bedtime, okay, and I'll be on the first flight tomorrow once I'm cleared to leave." "I will. And James?" "Yes. I'm proud of how you handled it. I know it couldn't have been easy to stay calm in that situation." After ending the call with Natalie, James made his way through the terminal toward the exit. He needed to find ground transportation to the Federal Air Marshal field office located in a nondescript building near the airport. As he walked, he noticed people glancing at his uniform, at the visible mark still on his cheek. He was used to being anonymous, to blending into crowds unnoticed. Today, that invisibility had been compromised. Before he reached the exit, he heard someone calling from behind him. "Agent Wilson. Excuse me." He turned to see Arthur Kellerman hurrying toward him, briefcase in hand. "Mr. Kellerman?" James acknowledged. "I thought you'd be in the rebooking line." "Already taken care of," Arthur said. "Perks of frequent flyer status. I wanted to catch you before you left. I've sent that video to my secure cloud storage. Here's a QR code that will give law enforcement access if needed." He handed James a business card with a QR code printed on the back. "Thank you," James said, genuinely appreciative of the lawyer's thoroughness. "This will be helpful." "It's clear-cut from a legal perspective," Arthur said, his professional assessment evident in his tone. "Unprovoked assault, clear racial animus expressed beforehand, multiple witnesses. The airline will be facing significant liability, not to mention the criminal aspects." James nodded. "It's out of my hands now. Other agencies will handle the investigation and any prosecutions." Arthur studied him for a moment. "You're remarkably calm about all this. If someone had slapped me and called me, well, said what she said to you, I'd be livid. Getting angry wouldn't have improved the situation," James replied simply. "My job was to ensure the safety of that aircraft and everyone on it. Personal feelings don't factor in." Still, Arthur said, "I'm sorry you had to experience that, especially in uniform. It was disgraceful. Unfortunately, it's not the first time I've encountered prejudice," James said, "but addressing it effectively is more important than dwelling on it." Arthur nodded, understanding the subtext of James's measured response. "Well, if you need anything, witness statement, testimony, whatever, you have my contact information. I fly through Atlanta twice a month, so I'm available if needed." With a handshake, they parted ways. James continued to the exit, his mind already organizing the sequence of events into the formal report format he would soon have to complete. The incident would be documented, processed, and eventually resolved through official channels. The system would work as designed. But as he stepped outside into the humid Atlanta afternoon, James allowed himself a brief moment of unguarded humanity. He closed his eyes, felt the sun on his face, and released a deep breath. Not just the recycled air from the airplane, but the weight of restraint he had maintained throughout the confrontation. For just that moment, he wasn't Air Marshal Wilson or Master Sergeant Wilson. He was just James, a man who had been demeaned and assaulted because of the color of his skin, and who was now facing yet another night away from the family he missed desperately. Then the moment passed. He squared his shoulders, hailed a cab, and prepared to do his duty. The personal reckoning would have to wait. It always did. 1 year after the incident on Monarch Airlines Flight 557, James Wilson found himself once again on a commercial flight. He was traveling from Atlanta to Denver for a training seminar, seated in an aisle seat in economy class. He wore civilian clothes, jeans, and a simple navy polo shirt, his Air Force uniform and Federal Air Marshal credentials safely stowed in his carry-on. The boarding process was smooth, the flight attendants professional and courteous. James observed them with the automatic vigilance that had become second nature in his years of service, noting their positioning, their attention to safety protocols, their interactions with passengers. It was a habit he couldn't turn off even when technically off duty. As the plane reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign dinged off a flight attendant, began the beverage service. She was in her mid-50s with silver streaks in her dark hair and laugh lines around her eyes that spoke of a lifetime of genuine smiles. "What can I get for you, sir?" she asked when she reached his row. "Ginger ale, please," James replied. She poured his drink with practiced efficiency, handing him the plastic cup with a warm smile. "There you go. Enjoy your flight." "Thank you," James said. Then after a moment's hesitation, he added, "I appreciate what you do." The flight attendant looked surprised but pleased. "Thank you for saying that. It means a lot." As she moved on to the next row, James sipped his ginger ale and reflected on the year that had passed. The viral incident had changed his life in ways he hadn't anticipated. Though he had tried to maintain his privacy, his identity as the Air Marshal had become known. The Federal Air Marshal Service had reassigned him to administrative and training duties for several months, concerned that his cover had been compromised. Initially, he had resented the desk assignment, viewing it as a setback to his career. But over time, he had come to see the value in sharing his experience with new recruits. His story had become a case study in threat assessment de-escalation techniques and the complex intersection of security protocols with issues of race and authority. The Secretary of Defense commendation had been unexpected. James had been honored at a small ceremony with Natalie and Dylan beaming proudly from the front row. The citation had praised his exceptional judgment and restraint in a volatile situation, noting that his actions had prevented escalation and ensured the safety of all passengers and crew. James had accepted the commendation with characteristic humility, uncomfortable with being celebrated for simply doing his job. What had stayed with him wasn't the medal or the certificate, but something Dylan had said afterward. "Dad," his son had asked as they left the ceremony, "why didn't you hit that lady back when she hit you?" James had considered the question carefully before answering. "Because that wouldn't have solved the problem, buddy. It would have made it worse." But she was being mean and racist, Dylan had persisted. "My friend Jake said you should have arrested her right away. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay calm when everyone else is losing their cool," James had explained. "My job wasn't to punish her. It was to keep everyone safe." The conversation had continued that evening at home, evolving into a deeper discussion about race authority and the responsibilities that came with power. It was a heavy topic for a 10-year-old, but James believed in being honest with his son about the realities he would face growing up as a young black man in America. Now, gazing out the airplane window at the clouds below, James thought about Rebecca Walsh. He rarely dwelled on her, but occasionally he wondered what had become of her. He had declined to make a victim impact statement at her sentencing, feeling that his professional role in the incident outweighed his personal response to her assault. He had seen the online vitriol directed at her, the gleeful pile-on as millions of strangers dissected her worst moment. While he couldn't find sympathy for her actions, he took no pleasure in her destruction. Justice to him wasn't about vengeance or humiliation. It was about accountability and hopefully change. The one thing he had insisted on when the Air Marshal Service Public Affairs Office was crafting their response to media inquiries was that his race be mentioned directly. Don't sanitize what happened, he had told them. This wasn't just about a flight attendant assaulting a passenger or a federal officer. It was about a white woman calling a black man your kind before slapping him. If we pretend that's not what happened, we're part of the problem. His phone buzzed with a text message from Natalie. Just checking in. How's the flight? Smooth, he typed back. Should land on time. Miss you and Dylan. We miss you too. Dylan has big news, aced his math test. He can't wait to tell you all about it. James smiled, feeling the familiar warmth that thoughts of his family always brought. This connection, this love, this simple exchange about math tests and missing each other was what mattered. Not medals or commendations or viral videos, just the steady, sustaining force of belonging to people who loved him completely. The flight attendant passed by again, checking on passengers. "Everything okay with your drink?" she asked. "Perfect, thank you," James replied. As she moved on, he returned to the book he'd been reading, a biography of Thurgood Marshall. But his thoughts kept drifting to broader reflections on the year that had passed. The incident had changed him, though not in ways visible to casual observers. He was still Master Sergeant Wilson, still Agent Wilson, still husband and father and son. But something in his understanding of his role, both in uniform and out of it, had deepened. He had always known that his uniform, his bearing, his very existence as a black man in a position of authority challenged certain people's worldview. What had changed was his acceptance that sometimes, simply by being who he was, he would force confrontations with that worldview. And when those confrontations came, he would face them with the same quiet dignity and unshakable resolve that had carried him through that April day on Flight 557. Not because he had to prove anything to anyone, but because that was who he was. 2 years after the incident on Flight 557, Rebecca Walsh was restocking napkin dispensers at Frank's Diner during a quiet afternoon lull. The lunch rush had ended, and only a few customers lingered over coffee and pie. The television mounted in the corner was playing a local news segment about an upcoming air show at the nearby military base. Rebecca barely glanced at it. She had learned to tune out news reports, especially anything related to aviation or the military. Such stories inevitably triggered memories she preferred to keep buried. The bell over the door jingled, signaling a new customer. Rebecca didn't look up, focused on her task and the mental calculations of how much tip money she might make on today's shift. She needed to make her car insurance payment by Friday, and she was still $20 short. "Table for one, please," a male voice said to Doris, the hostess. Something about the voice, its measured tone, its quiet authority made Rebecca freeze. She knew that voice. It had haunted her dreams for 2 years. Slowly she raised her eyes. Standing at the hostess stand was James Wilson. He was in civilian clothes, khaki pants, and a light blue button-down shirt, and carried a small duffel bag. He looked exactly as he had in the news clips and social media posts she had once obsessively followed. Composed, dignified, his bearing unmistakably military, even in casual attire. Doris led him to a booth near the window on the opposite side of the diner from where Rebecca stood. He sat down, his back to her, and accepted a menu. Rebecca's heart hammered in her chest. Her palms grew sweaty, and the familiar sensation of panic began to rise. Her therapist had warned her about this, the possibility of encountering triggers in everyday life, the need to develop coping mechanisms for when the past suddenly intruded on the present. She took a deep breath, counting silently as she had been taught. 4 counts in hold for 7, release for 8. The technique helped, but only marginally. Her mind raced with questions and fears. Would he recognize her? Would he make a scene? Should she hide in the kitchen until he left? Should she ask Frank to take over his table? Before she could decide on a course of action, Doris approached her. "Becky, honey, can you take table 12? I've got to make a phone call. My daughter's school just called." Rebecca looked at the table number on the check. Table 12. James Wilson's table. I don't think she began. But Doris was already hurrying toward the office, leaving Rebecca standing alone with the check in her trembling hand. This was it. The moment she had dreaded, and in some strange way anticipated for 2 years. The direct confrontation with the man whose life had intersected with hers in that catastrophic moment on Flight 557. With legs that felt like lead, she approached the table. James was studying the menu, unaware of her presence. She cleared her throat. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I get you something to drink?" James looked up, and for a moment there was no recognition in his eyes. Just the polite acknowledgement a customer gives a server. Then awareness dawned, and his expression shifted not to anger or disgust, but to something more complex. Surprise, certainly, and a wariness that was entirely understandable. "Ms. Walsh," he said quietly. "Yes," she confirmed, looking down at her order pad rather than meeting his eyes. "Would you prefer a different server? I can get someone else?" James was silent for a long moment, studying her. She had changed dramatically from the woman he remembered. The arrogant posture was gone, replaced by a hunched defensiveness. Her face, once carefully made up to project authority, was now bare of cosmetics and lined with stress. Her hair, which had been immaculately styled in her flight attendant days, was now pulled back in a simple ponytail. "No," he finally said. "That won't be necessary. I'll have coffee, please. Black." Rebecca nodded and turned quickly, retreating to the coffee station. Her hands shook as she filled a mug, causing hot liquid to splash onto her fingers. She barely felt the burn, her mind consumed by the surreal situation. Of all the diners in all the towns in all the world, he had to walk into hers. She returned with the coffee, setting it carefully on the table without meeting his gaze. "Are you ready to order, or do you need a few minutes?" "I'll have the club sandwich and fries," he said. "I'll put that right in, Rebecca," responded, taking the menu and turning to leave. "Ms. Walsh," James said, stopping her. "You don't need to be afraid of me." The simple statement, delivered without condescension or pity, broke something in Rebecca. She had spent 2 years imagining this man as alternately a victim of her cruelty and an avenging angel who had destroyed her life. She had projected onto him her own guilt, shame, and resentment. But here he was, just a man ordering coffee and a sandwich, telling her not to be afraid. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, finding her voice. "I'm afraid of myself, of what I did, of who I was." James nodded slowly, accepting her words without judgment. "I understand." Rebecca hesitated, then asked the question that had burned in her mind for 2 years. "Do you hate me?" "No," James replied without hesitation. "I never did." "You should," she said, her voice barely audible. "Everyone else does. I do. Hate doesn't solve anything," he said simply. "It just creates more of what we already have too much of in this world." Rebecca stood there, order pad clutched to her chest, fighting back tears. This was not how she had imagined this encounter would go. There was no recrimination, no righteous anger, just a quiet dignity that made her own past behavior seem all the more shameful by comparison. "I'll get your order in," she said finally, unable to process the complex emotions swirling within her. As she walked back to the kitchen, Rebecca felt as though she were moving through a dream. The universe had given her something she had never expected: a direct confrontation with her past, with the person she had wronged most directly. Not in a courtroom or a televised apology, but in the mundane setting of a roadside diner on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. She placed his order and took care of her other tables, moving automatically, her mind elsewhere. When his food was ready, she delivered it without comment, and he ate in silence, occasionally glancing at his phone. When he had finished and she brought his check, she finally found the courage to say what needed to be said. "Mr. Wilson," she began, her voice stronger now. "I know an apology is meaningless after everything that happened. Words can't undo what I did. But I am sorry. Deeply, genuinely sorry. Not just for what I did to you, but for who I was that day. For what I revealed about myself." James studied her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you for saying that," he said finally. "I believe you're sincere." He paid his bill, leaving a generous tip, and stood to leave. As he gathered his duffel bag, he paused. "Ms. Walsh," he said, "we don't get to choose the consequences of our actions, but we do get to choose who we become afterward. Remember that." With that, he walked out of the diner and out of her life once more, leaving Rebecca standing by the table, holding his empty coffee cup and feeling for the first time in 2 years the faintest glimmer of something that might, with time and effort, become peace. She watched through the window as he walked to his car, his posture straight, his stride confident. He didn't look back. And in that moment, Rebecca understood something profound about both of them. James Wilson had moved forward with his life not because he was untouched by their encounter, but because he had refused to let it define him. He had chosen who to become in its aftermath. Now it was her turn to make that same choice. As James Wilson drove away from the diner, the unexpected encounter with Rebecca Walsh replayed in his mind. He had recognized her immediately despite the dramatic changes in her appearance and demeanor. The transformation from the arrogant, entitled woman who had assaulted him to the humbled, anxious server he had just met was striking. He hadn't planned what to say to her. There had been no script prepared for a moment he had never expected to happen. But the words had come naturally, shaped by the perspective he had gained over the past 2 years. The road stretched before him, a straight line cutting through flat farmland. In the distance, the silhouettes of fighter jets from the nearby Air Force Base traced patterns against the blue sky, preparing for the upcoming air show. James watched them for a moment, feeling the familiar pull of his military identity. He thought about the path that had brought him here to this moment. The years of service, the dual role as Air Marshal, the incident on Flight 557, and everything that had followed. The publicity he had never wanted. The commendation he had accepted with mixed feelings, the conversations with Dylan about race and dignity and power, and now this chance meeting with the woman who had briefly but dramatically intersected with his life. What had struck him most about seeing Rebecca Walsh again was not her physical transformation, but the fundamental shift in her energy. The entitlement and anger that had radiated from her on the plane were gone, replaced by a palpable shame and regret. She was serving others now rather than demanding service. She was apologizing rather than accusing. James had no way of knowing if her transformation was genuine or lasting. People often changed when consequences forced them to only to revert to their true nature when the pressure eased. But he hoped for her sake and for the sake of anyone who crossed her path that she had truly learned from her fall. He didn't need her to suffer more than she already had. Justice to him wasn't about punishment. It was about growth, about becoming better than we were before. Sometimes that growth came from our triumphs, but more often it came from our failures, from moments when we were forced to confront the gap between who we thought we were and who we actually showed ourselves to be. His phone buzzed with a text message from Natalie. "How's the drive?" "Still on schedule." "On my way," he replied. "Should be home by dinner. Had an interesting day. Can't wait to hear about it," came her response. As he drove toward home, toward the family that anchored and sustained him, James reflected on the strange symmetry of his encounter with Rebecca. 2 years ago, she had held power over him, at least in her own mind. She had been in uniform, he in a passenger seat. She had tried to use her authority to demean him, to put him in his place. Today, the dynamic had been reversed. He had been the customer, she the server. He had held social power, she had been vulnerable. But he had chosen not to wield that power against her, not out of magnanimity or forgiveness, but because that simply wasn't who he was. The true measure of character, his father had always told him, wasn't how you treated people who could help you, but how you treated people who couldn't. It wasn't what you did when everyone was watching, but what you did when no one was. Today, in a nearly empty diner in a small town with no cameras rolling and no audience to impress, James had chosen kindness over retribution, dignity over domination. Not because Rebecca Walsh deserved it, but because it was the right thing to do. Because it was the example he wanted to set for his son. Because it was who he had decided to be. The incident on Flight 557 had lasted mere minutes. The viral video had played for days. The legal proceedings had stretched for months. But the ripple effects of that moment would continue for years. Perhaps lifetimes, touching not just James and Rebecca, but everyone who had witnessed it in person or through a screen. One person using their power to diminish another. One person refusing to be diminished. And in the space between those two choices, a lesson about dignity that transcended race uniform authority or status. As James turned onto the familiar street leading home, he felt a sense of completion. The circle that had begun 2 years ago on that Atlanta runway had finally closed. Whatever path Rebecca Walsh took from here was her own journey. His continued forward toward the porch light already glowing in the gathering dusk, toward the family waiting to welcome him home. And in that knowledge there was peace. If this story resonated with you,